I saw a guy at a high-end coffee shop the other day, hunched over a laptop with a copy of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra resting prominently on the table. He was talking loudly into his headset about crushing the competition and manifesting his own reality. When he hung up, he looked at the book with a kind of reverent intensity, telling me, unprompted, that most people are just herd animals waiting for permission to live. He, on the other hand, was following the path of the Übermensch. He spoke about self-mastery and total effort with a giddy, almost religious fervor, as if he had discovered a secret cheat code to the universe that rendered everyone else's struggles irrelevant. To him, Nietzsche wasn't a philosopher. He was a life coach for the elite. He was convinced that if you just will it hard enough, you can transcend any obstacle, and that those who complain about the system are simply trapped in what Nietzsche called slave morality, content to be victims. But then his expression shifted. He got an email, some news about a lawsuit or a permit being denied by a local government office that was clearly playing favorites with a larger corporation. In an instant, the Superman facade cracked. He didn't look like a creator of new values. He looked like a man who had just realized he was playing a game where the rules were written by someone else, and no amount of will to power was going to change the score. It made me realize how easily we've hijacked this vision of the Übermensch and turned it into a manifesto for toxic individualism. We love the idea of the lone wolf standing on a mountain peak, but we rarely ask, what happens when the mountain is rigged? Is this promise of total freedom a genuine path to the self, or is it just a way to shut our eyes to the walls of the cage we're actually living in? We need to talk about whether Nietzsche's most famous idea is a tool for liberation, or just a very sophisticated way to ignore the reality of being human in an unequal world. The topic placed before you is the profound tension between the philosophical ideal of the Übermensch, the overhuman, and the concrete realities of systemic inequality, power structures, and modern consumerism. The material includes philosophical analyses of power and resistance, political theory, critiques of market humanism, and contemporary narratives of self-overcoming. The mission is to dissect how the drive for ultimate autonomy collides with the structural, biological, and economic realities of the modern world.
That collision between the individual philosophical ideal and structural reality is comprehensively demonstrated in the narrative of Arav. Placed in the rapidly expanding tech corridors of Bengaluru, the physical environment presents this stark, undeniable dichotomy. On one side, you have these gleaming glass towers, heavily air-conditioned, totally insulated from the elements.
Right, representing the absolute pinnacle of globalized capital.
Exactly. And standing in direct contrast beneath them are sprawling, dusty settlements that lack even basic municipal infrastructure. Now, Arav secured a highly coveted coding job. This physically and economically lifted him out of a lower middle-class background.
And this elevation is what catalyzed a deeply distorted adoption of the Nietzschean lens for him.
Yeah, the sudden influx of capital and status was internalized by him, not as the result of a specific market demand for his skill set, but as a biological or spiritual manifestation of his own Übermensch status. He positioned himself entirely above what he perceived as the slave morality of his former peers.
And the psychological mechanisms of that separation require careful examination. When those peers vocalized legitimate grievances regarding objectively measurable phenomena like exponentially rising rents, lack of infrastructure, the exploitation of gig workers,
We just dismissed them.
their complaints were immediately categorized by Arav merely as a deficiency of individual will. The structural realities of urban gentrification were entirely ignored in favor of a framework that blamed the displaced for their displacement.
Convenient. Furthermore, the reliance of his own family on essential social safety nets in the city's outskirts was viewed not as a predictable consequence of economic stratification, but as an indicator of spiritual weakness.
I mean, this ideological framework prompted a complete cessation of his visits to them.
Yeah.
The belief system demanded total isolation from anyone exhibiting vulnerability because vulnerability was classified as a moral failure rather than an economic condition.
But the structural foundation of this heavily insulated belief system was exposed with brutal efficiency. There was a sudden systemic collapse in the local tech sector. A shift in global algorithms and a contraction in venture capital resulted in mass, indiscriminate layoffs.
And suddenly the individual will, which Arav championed as the ultimate invincible arbiter of success, possessed absolutely no currency to pay accumulating medical bills.
None at all. It held no legislative power to halt the execution of a sudden eviction notice. The structural safety net that he had continuously mocked was suddenly absent from his own life,
revealing that the transcendence he believed he had achieved was inextricably linked to a temporary platform of economic and systemic privilege.
a privilege that had remained entirely unacknowledged during his period of prosperity.
It shows that believing one has transcended the world is an exceptionally easy cognitive operation when the mechanics of the world quietly operate in one's favor.
Mistaking proximity to institutional or economic power for internal philosophical strength presents a severe and recurring danger. Philosophy becomes fundamentally distorted when it functions primarily as an excuse to look down upon populations caught within the gears of an economic system that was never designed for their victory.
The failure of Erov's personal philosophy wasn't merely a loss of income. It was the catastrophic realization that his internal fortitude was insufficient to counter external macroeconomic forces. The individual will cannot rewrite the fundamental laws of property or the legal mechanisms of debt collection.
This profound distortion necessitates a rigorous foundational examination of the origins of the Will zur Macht, the will to power. The concept operates as the fundamental drive animating all biological and psychological life. But it is crucial to distinguish this from Charles Darwin's evolutionary framework or Arthur Schopenhauer's concept of the will to life.
Right, because for Schopenhauer, the fundamental drive was merely the blind, irrational impulse to continue existing, to survive and reproduce.
And the will to power explicitly rejects mere survival as the primary goal. Life itself is defined not by a defensive will to existence, but by a dynamic, offensive assertion of strength and continuous self-overcoming. Organisms will frequently risk their own survival, endure immense pain, and court destruction precisely to expand their power, influence, and mastery over their environment.
The formulation posits that every living entity inherently strives for growth, excellence, and the expansion of its own state of being. The creation of tables of values, the imposition of these specific values upon human populations, and the subsequent judgment of the world according to these constructed metrics represent the highest order expressions of this fundamental drive.
It is an irrational force that resides deeper than the intellect. The intellect is merely an instrument, a surface-level tool developed by the will to power to further its own ends. Therefore, all human endeavors, whether categorized as artistic creation, scientific inquiry, or political organization, are fundamentally expressions of the singular underlying drive attempting to exert form upon the chaos of reality.
Now, the variant concept, Will zur Überwältigung, which translates precisely as the will to overpower, requires the strictest analytical distinction here.
Absolutely. Taking this variant literally as an endorsement of brute physical domination or the military crushing of others fundamentally skews the entire philosophical architecture. The mandate of true greatness dictates that the will must be directed inward.
The highest expressions of this drive are achieved exclusively through self-mastery and profound self-transformation.
The objective is not the external subjugation of neighboring actors or the accumulation of political subjects. It is the harnessing of internal chaotic forces, passions, instincts, and desires to create a unified, higher state of individual being.
The noble type of person determines value internally. They don't require the external approval of a collective, nor do they require the physical subjugation of the weak to validate their own existence. Their power is self-justifying and self-contained.
The historical trajectory of this concept involves a heavily documented and catastrophic hijacking. Following the philosopher's total cognitive collapse in 1889, his sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, gained complete legal control over his vast literary estate.
She systematically collated unpublished, fragmented, and often discarded notes into spurious, heavily edited texts.
And the editorial process actively and deliberately aligned the philosophy with rising German nationalism and virulent anti-Semitism.
Ideologies the original texts explicitly, repeatedly, and aggressively condemned. The philosopher had famously broken with Richard Wagner over the composer's anti-Semitism and German nationalism, yet the archive was manipulated to suggest the exact opposite alignment.
The intellectual architecture was thus twisted by Nazi ideologues, most notably figures like Alfred Boimler, to provide a veneer of philosophical justification for military aggression, racial doctrine, and totalitarian expansion.
This culminated in the horrific, systemic implementation of these distorted ideals during the 20th century.
The rhetoric of the Übermensch was entirely detached from its original requirement of inward psychological self-mastery and artificially mapped onto state-sponsored atrocities and biological determinism. The concept of creating new values was perverted into the destruction of populations deemed inferior by a state apparatus.
Which represents the ultimate violation of the philosophy. utilizing the language of individual overcoming to enforce the most rigid, oppressive form of collective herd conformity ever devised.
Consequently, the philosophy has been adopted across the entire political spectrum over the subsequent decades. Right-wing interpretations actively utilize the concepts of aristocratic radicalism, absolute hierarchy, and the severe critique of egalitarianism.
These interpretations posit that true cultural greatness requires the abandonment of democratic leveling, arguing that treating all individuals as equal suppresses the emergence of exceptional human beings.
Conversely, left-wing interpretations focus heavily on avant-garde resistance, absolute anti-authoritarianism, and the overcoming of oppressive, historically contingent societal norms. These readings emphasize the dismantling of established power structures to forge new, liberated identities free from traditional moral constraints.
The deep dive does not endorse any of these political viewpoints, whether left-wing or right-wing, but is impartially conveying the diverse political applications present in the foundational material.
The profound divergence of these interpretations extends deeply into the clinical realm of psychology and psychoanalysis. Alfred Adler actively integrated the will to power as the absolute centerpiece of his system of individual psychology.
In Adler's framework, the drive is utilized primarily to combat inherent universal feelings of inferiority, often originating in childhood helplessness, through a continuous, lifelong striving for superiority.
All human motivation, including social cooperation and ambition, is categorized as a search for power or success. Adler positions psychological pleasure strictly as a derivative of power, and psychological pain as a direct derivative of feebleness or the inability to exert control over one's environment.
But Viktor Frankl presented a rigorous counter-framework, heavily informed by his survival of the concentration camps, centered entirely on the will to meaning.
Frankl argued that the pursuit of power is merely a substitute, a secondary compensation that arises only when the primary will to meaning is frustrated.
Psychoanalysis and its subsequent offshoots thus attempted to democratize and clinicalize the drive for power. They shifted the arena of overcoming from the grand historical creation of civilization-defining values down to the daily navigation of individual neuroses and the pursuit of baseline psychological health.
The Übermensch was translated from a world historical figure into a functioning, well-adjusted patient.
The severe tension between cultivated internal psychological states and inescapable external systemic realities is illustrated perfectly by the narrative of Elena. Residing as a tenured academic in a major European capital currently gripped by a severe systemic housing crisis, Elena dedicated decades to the rigorous study of Stoic detachment and Nietzschean independence.
The primary objective of her daily practice was the cultivation of a true, unassailable self that existed entirely above the political fray and the volatile protests frequently occurring in the streets below her apartment.
This practice of internal freedom functioned on the foundational belief that one's internal values and psychological state could be fully insulated from the chaotic demands and suffering of the external herd.
The pivotal moment of crisis occurred when she stood on her balcony and observed her elderly neighbor, a resident of the same building for 40 consecutive years, being forcibly removed by state-sanctioned bailiffs to facilitate immediate luxury renovations by a foreign investment firm.
The internal peace she had meticulously cultivated through years of philosophical detachment instantly transformed into a crushing, inescapable heavy weight of complicity.
The sudden realization materialized that deliberately refusing to resist external injustice effectively transforms internal freedom into a sterile prison of isolation. She observed that the bailiffs did not care about her internal state of self-mastery. The structural violence proceeded irrespective of her philosophical elevation.
The subsequent descent from her metaphorical academic mountain to physically join a local neighborhood defense committee marked the profound discovery that true agency involves the difficult, compromised choice to fight for the dignity of others while attempting to maintain individual integrity.
Inner freedom possesses the dangerous capacity to easily become a functional synonym for apathy. When philosophical detachment successfully prevents an individual from taking concrete action against observable systemic cruelty, that internal peace operates as a tacit, material endorsement of the status quo.
The strongest configuration of the self is definitively not the one that stands in isolated, pristine superiority, untouched by the world, but the one that consciously and vigorously engages with the friction, dirt, and complexity of material reality.
This exact friction is the primary focal point of the French post-structuralist critique of autonomy, a theoretical movement led by foundational theorists such as Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, and Gilles Deleuze.
To understand their critique, the traditional baseline must be established: the Cartesian view. The philosophy of René Descartes posits a unified, conscious self, an I, that initiates action, possesses free will, and stands fundamentally apart from the material world it observes.
The post-structuralist perspective fundamentally, aggressively rejects this premise. Drawing heavily on the decentralized nature of the will to power, the body is analyzed not as a single vehicle piloted by a conscious mind, but as a vast multiplicity of competing microscopic forces, drives, and social modules.
In this framework, consciousness is decidedly not the causal initiator of experience. It is merely a delayed, experiential byproduct of internal physiological and sociological conflicts.
The sensation of a unified sovereign ego, the feeling that you are making a conscious choice, is analyzed merely as the temporary, fortuitous triumph of certain dominant forces within this complex, internal political organization.
Deleuze emphasizes that there is no single, unified subject operating at the core of the human being. Rather, the human entity is a chaotic multiplicity that retrospectively constructs an imaginary, narrative unity for itself to function within human society. The self is not a noun. It is an ongoing, highly unstable process.
Michel Foucault's exhaustive analysis of power dissects precisely how these forces operate both externally upon the body and internally within the psyche. A crucial epical distinction is made between historical forms of control.
Sovereign power was the historical right of the king to publicly execute or extract wealth.
This evolved into disciplinary power, which encompasses the subtle, pervasive social forces that continuously shape individuals in schools, prisons, and factories.
Finally, Foucault identifies biopower, which involves the vast statistical social forces that shape and manage entire populations.
Disciplinary power normalizes behavior through constant surveillance, both real and imagined, creating subjects who ultimately inscribe power relations upon themselves. The individual internalizes the gaze of authority, effectively becoming the principle of their own subjection, policing their own behavior without the need for external force.
Biopower manages the biological mechanics of life itself. It operates through the regulation of public health, mortality rates, sanitation, and reproductive policies.
In this totalizing matrix, Foucault argues that resistance is intimately, inextricably bound to the very social structures it attempts to oppose. Utopian imaginings of absolute freedom are continually constrained by the linguistic and social categories they desperately attempt to escape.
For instance, teenagers longing for a radical world entirely without parental authority are still fundamentally presupposing and relying upon the subject identity of the teenager. This specific identity is produced and defined exclusively by the exact familial and societal organization they deeply resent.
Therefore, resistance does not and cannot exist outside of the power dynamic. It is an intrinsic, reactive component of the power matrix itself.
Pierre Bourdieu introduces the complex sociological concept of the habitus, which further severely complicates the traditional notion of autonomous free will.
The habitus consists of the deeply ingrained habits, physical skills, linguistic tics, and aesthetic dispositions possessed by individuals as a direct, cumulative result of their specific life experiences and class background.
Crucially, these dispositions operate entirely below the threshold of conscious decision-making. They dictate how an individual holds their body, the exact syntax they use when speaking to authority figures, and what they intuitively classify as comfortable or alien.
Social determinants exert significantly more effect the less they are consciously perceived by the subject. Individuals continuously make choices, but they make these choices within a highly structured historical and economic situation that they did not consciously structure themselves.
The prevailing societal illusion that the social playing field is inherently level functions to perpetuate the illusion that comportment, generally understood as individual freedom, is genuine.
If an individual succeeds, the habitus allows them to perceive this success as the result of pure will, completely ignoring the invisible accumulated advantages of their socialization.
Objective sociological knowledge acts as a potential, albeit difficult, neutralizing agent against this illusion. By rigorously mapping the exact asymmetrical dimensions of the social situation, the reflexive analytical awareness of these historical constraints can begin to neutralize the automatic force of bodily dispositions.
True emancipation is achieved exclusively by freeing the individual from the misplaced narcissistic belief in their own illusory freedom.
The ultimate synthesis of individual autonomy and inescapable fate within this highly determined post-structuralist matrix is found in the formulation of Amor Fati, the love of fate.
Achieving true philosophical autonomy requires not merely a passive stoic resignation to the heavy necessity of all things. Passive endurance is still categorized as a reactive, subordinate state.
Amor Fati demands the aggressive, active affirmation and willing of that exact necessity. The individual must look at the totality of their existence, including the suffering, the systemic constraints, and the immovable forces of history, and declare it necessary and beautiful.
It is the ultimate rejection of resentment against the past. The paradox operates precisely as follows. An individual becomes autonomous not by magically stepping outside the physical universe or escaping the deterministic, grinding forces of nature and society. The fantasy of the unbound self is a psychological evasion.
Autonomy is realized strictly by acknowledging total, unmitigated vulnerability to fortune and the vast network of external constraints.
By recognizing the absolute impossibility of an unbound, context-free existence, the individual transforms the passive historical reality of "it was" into the active, creative assertion of "thus I willed it."
True freedom is measured not by the absence of obstacles, but by the exact degree of exertion required to resist the resistance to it, necessitating a joyous and fiercely trusting fatalism in the face of insurmountable odds.
The aggressive commodification of this pursuit of self-overcoming within modern consumer culture is vividly, tragically demonstrated by the narrative of Julian and Maya.
Julian operated successfully as a high-profile, highly compensated life coach in Los Angeles, aggressively monetizing a proprietary brand he titled Radical Overcoming. The doctrine preached to his clientele of affluent tech entrepreneurs and real estate developers asserted that absolutely any barrier, economic, physical, or psychological, could be entirely conquered by a sufficiently powerful, disciplined spirit.
Maya, identified as his star, most dedicated pupil, adhered rigorously to the mandated Übermensch protocol. She woke precisely at 4 a.m. daily to meditate, consume optimized supplements, and actively manifest strength, all while managing the exhaustion of working 3 separate service sector jobs.
Her desperate objective was to accumulate enough capital to afford her son's specialized, heavily gated healthcare. The intense internal will cultivated by Maya eventually collided with the entirely indifferent, immovable structural barriers of the American healthcare system.
The realization upon their inevitable face-to-face meeting was stark and devastating to the philosophical framework. The philosophy meticulously marketed and monetized by Julian was explicitly revealed to be a luxury good.
It effectively sold a highly curated narrative of individual overcoming to populations that already possessed a massive, unacknowledged systemic head start. Julian's wealthy clients were overcoming the minor psychological friction of boredom or the desire to increase their profit margins from 10% to 15%.
Maya, however, was engaged in an agonizing attempt to move a literal mountain with a plastic spoon. The sheer force of her internal will was irrelevant to a medical billing department demanding immediate, exorbitant payment.
Julian's subsequent radical pivot away from individual coaching toward advocating for structural policy changes represented a profound, necessary acknowledgement that philosophical will requires a baseline foundation of basic human dignity and material security to function.
Meritocracy is frequently purposefully deployed as a structural myth to silence the disadvantaged, suggesting that failure is always a moral or spiritual deficit rather than a mathematical certainty of the system.
Overcoming a 10-foot concrete wall while standing on a small ladder is a systemic physical impossibility. Addressing the situation strictly by encouraging the individual on the ladder to will harder is an act of profound bad faith without actively addressing the structural architecture of the wall itself.
The systemic dynamic at play here represents the phenomenon of the last human, the letzter Mensch, successfully masquerading as the overhuman. Modern consumer culture functions as a highly sophisticated dialectical space.
It simultaneously aggressively promotes baseline humanistic values, the desire for absolute comfort, the eradication of physical pain, equality of access to commodities, safety protocols, and highly predictable market solutions, while concurrently marketing the aesthetic of aristocratic ambitions.
Subjects within this system are constantly promised the capacity to be superior to the vast majority, to demonstrate absolute exceptionalism through their purchasing power or lifestyle optimization.
Individuals intensely, desperately desire the elevated status, the linguistic markers, and the visual aesthetic of the Übermensch.
Yet, when confronted with actual risk, severe discomfort, or the necessity to genuinely break with societal norms, they consistently and willingly choose the safety, convenience, and market-coordinated solutions entirely characteristic of the herd.
They wish to summit the mountain, but only if there is a paved road and a gift shop at the peak. This creates a pervasive systemic deadlock across society where true, dangerous overcoming is perpetually deferred in favor of safe, commodified simulation. The marketplace provides the exact feeling of rebellion without any of the material consequences of actual revolt.
This specific commodification manifests clearly in three distinct sociological archetypes. The first is defined as the big zombie.
This archetype aggressively pursues social status and a feeling of existence entirely through overconsumption, fundamentally exchanging the risk of self-originated experience for highly predictable, rationally derived commodity forms.
The genuine pursuit of greatness, which inherently involves the high probability of catastrophic failure, is entirely replaced by repetitive, intensely pleasurable mini-activities. The constructed environment of the ESPN Zone Chicago exemplifies this specific spatial psychology.
Individuals are completely enveloped in a highly structured, inescapable inferno of glowing screens, relentless noise, and processed food, rendering active, critical engagement entirely obsolete in favor of passive, overwhelming sensory saturation.
The modern Las Vegas casino operates on the exact same psychological principles, systematically infantilizing adults. Individuals wander in comfortable sweatsuits through environments designed to eliminate the concept of natural time.
Waiting passively for market-coordinated gratification through slot machines that simulate the thrill of risk without requiring any actual skill or physical danger. Furthermore, the Tough Mudder Adventure Challenge provides a prime example of scripting and coordinating physical pain for profit.
Participants actively purchase a highly structured, legally insured process of self-renewal. They endure mud and mild electric shocks, eventually receiving a brightly colored headband as a definitive symbol of their toughness.
This entirely bypasses the authentic, unscripted peril, genuine isolation, and severe, unmitigated danger actually required for true greatness. The struggle is purchased, regulated, and ultimately safe.
The second prevailing archetype is the cyborg. This figure emerges directly from the accelerating transhumanist ideology and the pervasive quantified self-movement.
The individual's reliance is placed heavily, almost religiously, upon biotechnology, continuous health tracking devices, and predictive artificial intelligence algorithms. The primary overriding objective is to mathematically extend lifespan, constantly optimize physical and cognitive outputs, and systematically, technologically avoid the reality of mortality.
This extreme technological outsourcing directly contradicts the fundamental philosophical mandate to cheerfully embrace hardship, physical decay, and severe, unmediated tests of the spirit.
Utilizing proprietary tracking algorithms to dictate daily behavior, sleep schedules, and dietary intake reflects an all-too-human, deeply conservative instinct for self-recovery and self-preservation at all costs.
By systematically attempting to remove the organic, unpredictable challenges of finite biological existence, the cyborg deliberately delegates the mastering of existential problems to deterministic, corporate-owned technologies.
This delegation effectively cancels the necessity to struggle, suffer, and independently create new values. The drive for optimization replaces the drive for greatness, substituting a measurable metric of heart rate variability for the unmeasurable metric of a profoundly lived life.
The third distinct archetype is the slacktivist. This subject engages heavily in corporate lifestyle environmentalism and highly visible commodity activism.
The mechanisms of this engagement include the purchasing of fair trade certified coffee, driving hybrid or electric sedans, or participating in highly coordinated social media boycotts of specific brands.
These actions offer a momentary, highly effective interpassive escape from actual ethical responsibility. Interpassivity is the phenomenon where the object or the action consumes or protests on the subject's behalf.
The individual entertains the psychological idea of enacting radical change with absolutely minimal personal commitment or risk to their own social standing.
The comforting illusion of resistance is achieved flawlessly without the requirement of physical courage, significant financial or personal sacrifice, or the profound, sustained discomfort absolutely necessary to execute true, structural systemic change.
The market brilliantly provides a highly profitable release valve for political malcontent. By allowing individuals to purchase products coded as ethical or rebellious, the overarching system ensures that genuinely revolutionary impulses are safely and predictably channeled back into standard consumption habits.
This ensures the uninterrupted preservation of the overarching economic logic. The revolution is not defeated, it is simply monetized and sold back to the consumer at a premium.
These three distinct archetypes currently reside entirely within the overarching sociological condition defined as anti-humanism.
This state represents a perpetual, inescapable deadlock. Individuals loudly and publicly reject traditional humanist ideals in principle, professing a deep aesthetic desire to transcend the mundane realities of daily life, the equalizing forces of mass society, and the suffocating limitations of the herd mentality.
They utilize the vocabulary of radical individualism and disruption, yet they simultaneously reproduce these exact humanist ideals in practice by continually prioritizing absolute physical security, digital convenience, and market-approved identities above all else.
They remain fundamentally trapped in a philosophical antechamber. They have explicitly abandoned the lasting humanism of the past in their rhetoric and self-perception, viewing themselves as advanced or evolved beyond traditional morality.
However, they entirely lack the fortitude, risk tolerance, and genuine willingness to suffer required to achieve true self-overcoming. Consequently, they settle instead for the safe, commodified echoes of greatness readily provided by the marketplace, mistaking a curated lifestyle brand for a genuine philosophical breakthrough.
The aesthetic of the Übermensch is achieved, while the rigorous, terrifying substance is entirely avoided.
Addressing the severe division between public, structural necessity, and private, philosophical aspiration requires an exhaustive examination of Richard Rorty's concept of pragmatic containment.
The philosophical argument posits a strict, absolutely necessary separation between the realm of public democratic utility and the realm of private self-creation. The drive for individual self-perfection, the esoteric pursuit of sublimity, and the radical Nietzschean revaluation of all values belong exclusively and permanently to the private sphere.
Thinkers and authors like Marcel Proust and Vladimir Nabokov perfectly exemplify this strictly private pursuit. They dedicate their lives to constructing intricate, highly idiosyncratic vocabularies for their own aesthetic and philosophical salvation, entirely detached from any obligation to civic duty or public morality.
The profound danger emerges instantly when the intense philosophy of radical self-creation is mistakenly applied to national politics, economics, or the administration of public institutions.
Public spheres inherently and unavoidably require the maintenance of human solidarity, the recognition of shared biological and economic vulnerability, and the active bureaucratic minimization of cruelty.
These baseline civic requirements are fundamentally, irrevocably at odds with an aristocratic, anti-egalitarian ethos that dismisses the vast majority of the population as a weak herd.
When the relentless pursuit of the Übermensch breaches the protective boundary of the private realm and attempts to dictate public policy or economic structures, the immediate result is the destruction of the fragile egalitarian frameworks absolutely necessary to protect vulnerable populations from institutionalized cruelty and exploitation.
The specialized vocabulary of radical self-creation is entirely useless and often highly destructive for the practical work of addressing systemic injustice.
Freudian psychoanalysis acts as a crucial historical bridge in the democratization of psychology, making the elite concept of self-creation accessible to the broader population without requiring the dangerous destruction of public utility.
Traditional aristocratic self-creation demanded the forceful imposition of a grand, singular taste by which all of society would be judged and ultimately found wanting. The democratization of this process via psychoanalysis shifts the entire focus inward, removing the collateral damage.
Individuals are tasked with creating personalized, non-imposing narratives by meticulously making peace with their specific, often traumatic pasts. The objective is strictly to uncover the blind impresses, the unconscious historical, societal, and familial forces that continuously shape individual psychology.
Self-creation is thus achieved entirely through internal psychological integration and the conscious mapping of one's own traumas, rather than through the dangerous outward domination of external social structures or other individuals.
The fundamental drive to transcend the self is consistently, unavoidably mediated by the inescapable realities of structural inequality, deep societal conditioning, and the highly seductive, pervasive comforts of advanced consumer capitalism.
The relentless attempt to forge an entirely autonomous, unbound existence is repeatedly, systematically challenged by the heavily rigged mechanics of the modern marketplace and the inherent, inescapable biological vulnerability of the human condition.
The overarching structures of power, whether they manifest as disciplinary institutions, biological imperatives, or complex macroeconomic forces, absolutely do not vanish simply because an individual exerts the internal will to ignore them.
The reality placed before you is the enduring paradox of the human condition. The realization that the ultimate exertion of power is not the futile denial of the cage that surrounds society, but the precise, unblinking calculation of its exact dimensions.